Hello. And you hear me okay? So very good. And I will be online as well. Hopefully people online can hear me as well. So welcome to this lecture. Welcome to those of you in person today. Good to see so many friendly faces in the room. And also we have online attendees as well. So welcome to you as online attendees. This is the Railway Division Chair's address for 2023, entitled Along the Way, and will be presented by Andrew Skinner, who, as well as being the Railway Division Chair for this year, is also the Head of Engineering for Great Western Railway. I'm James Collinson, a previous Chair of the Railway Division a couple of years ago, and I'm delighted to be chairing this lecture and introducing Andrew to you in a moment. However, a couple of formalities before we do make a start. So mostly addressed to the people in the room, because the people online won't need to worry about any fire procedures in this building. In the event of an alarm, please evacuate the building immediately. The fire exit, the main fire exit, is right behind you. And then you're making your way as quickly as you can round to the main entrance through the main door. And then when you come out the door, you take a left. And the designated assembly point is at the cockpit stairs, basically the first set of stairs that you come across when you're walking down the footpath alongside the road. So that's the fire bit. Other thing to remind you about, mobile phones. Could you please make sure they're set to silent, stun, or off, whichever you prefer, so that they don't interrupt Andrew while he's sharing his thoughts with you. So for those of you online, after Andrew has done his presentation, there will be a Q&A session. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, I'll be able to help share some of those later on towards the end. And obviously people in the room, it's the usual, put your real hand up, and we'll take it from there. So how to introduce Andrew with giving too much away and avoiding giving you too many spoilers about what he's going to talk to us about today. So what I can say, he's a mechanical engineer. Good start. He's a railway engineer. And that's about really as much as I can say without spoiling everything else he's going to talk about. But from a personal perspective, so I've known Andrew for a number of years now, working with him largely through institution activities. There's two things that have struck me about Andrew. He's very much a family person. So he's always thinking about the things he does and how that impacts on his family. Whether it's his wife or his two daughters. His two daughters are both now over 18 and starting their independent adult journeys, but they're still very much part of his life. But there's also the railway family. Same thing, actually. He's always conscious of the things that he does and how it impacts on the people around him. Yes, much larger family, but very much kind of almost like his core. The second thing I know about Andrew, well, I've come to learn about him, he is an incredibly passionate English Welshman. And with that teaser, I'll hand over to Andrew.
I'll turn that one on. Does that work okay? Thank you very much for that introduction, James. Thank you to everybody who's attended this evening, to those of you in the room, and also to everybody online that has joined me for my address along the way. So this is what I'd like to cover tonight. I've got a little question. Where did it begin? Along the way came to me because I didn't really want to make this a complete bio. So it's really my thoughts and experiences that have come to me along the way that I then summarise part way through. There's a little bit about how the railway division fits. And then I turn slightly and just think about where we are now. I got my crystal ball out, so I know all about the future. Please, no HS2 questions. And I'd like to conclude with my priorities for my year as chair. So there's the killer question. Did it begin in Clapton? I think the answer's yes. So, okay, there I am. I'm not quite 2 and I'm already adopting the pose. So I guess maybe the end for me was inevitable. Obviously, that was a little light-hearted, but really my interest grew on Sunday afternoons. And one of 2 things happened. My mum at the time worked nights. Dad needed to get me out of the house. He was interested in railways. We lived in Bedfordshire. So I was dragged across to the East Coast Main Line and I had to watch Deltics on a Sunday afternoon. I didn't put up much of a fuss. So that was an interesting start for me and really, I think, swelled my passion. The other thing I did was some work for a guy in our local town that had quite a collection at the time of memorabilia. I do all sorts of things for him. It started out with a bit of gardening and painting of signs. But then he bought a 15-lever Midland frame. And he had to think about what he wanted to do with it. And it was just a bare frame at the time. And he said to me, when I went one Sunday afternoon, he said, look, I've sketched out this signalling plan for a station, siding, mainline crossover and all the rest of it. Would you fit the interlocking for me? Well, I was no signalling fitter. So, of course, at the age of 15, I had to read a little bit around it, work out the interlocking. There's the frame. Designed it all myself and fitted it. Of course, the Midland frames were unusual because the interlocking was actually above the ground. So it's in the tray at the back of that frame. That meant if you were maintaining it, you could do it in decent light. You weren't downstairs with the rats trying to do it, reaching high into the air. And the other thing from a mechanical engineering perspective, of course, the pivot point was above the floor. So they were actually a much easier pull. So that was Sundays for me. So what next? I had 3 thoughts around a career. Join the police service. There's some shock horror from some of my friends in the audience at this. I've obviously never told them. Teach maths or go into rail engineering. I think the police was a flash in the pan. I'm glad I didn't go into teaching maths because I really don't think I'd have the patience. So hopefully I found what was right for me. But I nearly didn't get here. The secondary school I went to in Cheltenham was rich hunting ground for Doughty. And at the time I was putting in for sponsorships to go to university. Of course, I dutifully put into Doughty. I got the offer and I accepted it. A week later, the railway write to me and say, here's an offer from us. And I can still remember the guy at Doughty's when I phoned him up. He said, look, Andrew, he said, I knew your heart was in the railway. You go and enjoy what you want to do and all the best. And, you know, that stuck with me. So it really all began one Monday, too long ago really to remember. I set off from home, excited, but with some trepidation. And of course, I needed to get to where I needed to get that first day. So there's the ticket that started it all. I've still got it at home, dated, of course, the 14th, because it was a return. So I needed to come back on the Friday. And of course, to accompany that, the ubiquitous pass. But interestingly, I didn't end up in Derby as most of the sponsored students did. You can probably see from the right-hand picture, I was actually allocated to Doncaster work, something that I think retrospectively was actually really good for me. So that's where I ended up. That's the Grove in Watford. It's a hotel now. It was a management training centre. I turned up on that first day, checked in at reception, went up to my room, and there's an extra bed. I thought no more of it. 20 minutes later, there's a knock on the door. This is my room. No, it's my room. No, it's... Anyway, you get the drift. We were sharing. The specific point here, though, is that that individual I'm still really good friends with today. So it really was friends for life. Sorry, Robin, I'm talking about Duncan, not you. We had a really interesting first week. This, of course, was the era of British Rail cardboard sandwiches. So we had a couple of board members come to speak to us. One of them was Prue Leith. Of course, at the time, she'd been sent in to sort out the cardboard sandwich problem, but interesting excursion from engineering nonetheless. The first safety lesson was probably the indoor putting. So there was a green outside, the clubs and balls were kept in the bar. And one evening we decided that we'd get a few pint mugs, lay them empty on their sides at the end of the room. And of course we had a round of putting, but it didn't all end too well. And of course we had to tidy the glass up after ourselves. So that was week one. Week two, we ended up at the Railway Engineering School, as it was. There's a picture of it in Derby on the engineering management training course. Really good grounding, all sorts of things happening there. Engine courses, brake courses, electrical courses, and a wonderful setup with a Sulzer engine from a class 24 and a class 47 cubicle. And the instructors there were quite fiendish at putting faults on the system to the extent that they would substitute auxiliary contacts on contactors for ones that they'd pre-lacquered. They looked fine. Of course, they didn't conduct. If you didn't get your meter out, you didn't find the fault. There's a few of us from those early days. And I was then sent off to Doncaster. So this was really the start of the heavy engineering, as you could see there. That's 4-bay, the engine repairs. And because I was on my own and not with a lot of other grads, in a way you were unique. And if you showed an interest, an awful lot of the people there would give you a lot of their time, and a lot of that time and the tuition and training they gave you stood you in really good stead. So that's why I feel I was fortunate to end up in Doncaster. I'd always drunk tea, but I think this is where I really got a love of tea, and it was with the Turbocharger gang. They had a teapot larger than the teapot that the Breakdown gang have. Some of you will, most of you might get that. Water and tea leaves went in, tea was poured out. I never actually looked inside the pot, never saw it emptied. So I don't know what was in the bottom, but it was wonderful tea. And then I moved on to build, the Class 58 build. Why do the underframes sag? Surely you don't build a locomotive like that. Of course, they were on jigs, they were upside down. It was the underframe equipment being put on from the top, and they were then spun round. And when the upstairs equipment was put on, of course, the underframe would level out. But it was an interesting question for a young engineer to ask and try and muse why these underframes were sagged. I ended up doing all sorts of other things. Of course, there was the paint shop, there was loco test. That was an interesting one for me. I was part of the very last Class 03 overhaul, and to see the gearbox and final drive stripped down and rebuilt was, well, it blew my mind at the time. That's an interesting photograph. You probably can't see the detail, but those of you that know would probably tell me that that's Leviathan. We took locos out on test as the last part of our training. I took them down to Peterborough. And we pulled into Peterborough with this particular loco, and there were a few people on the end of the platform that were getting really, really excited, pointing back down the train. Mister, mister. We thought, have we got a dragging brake? Are we on fire? What's the problem? And the problem was the nameplate. The nameplate's glorious. And we discovered that the way the nameplates were put on post-works was that someone was sent across to the loco with a tape measure. They would measure the patch that had been painted over where the nameplate was, go to the security lodge, and as long as one was that length, it got put on the side. So that's Leviathan masquerading as glorious. So for me, those really were formative years, an awful lot to learn that then was perpetuated in York at the Carriage Works for carriage build. Electric multiple units were being built for the sheer electrification at the same time. I had some depot experience, again, some dirty hard work, but a really good grounding. So underframe cleaning, brake block changes, all those things that are really useful to get under your belt and understand. And then possibly a highlight for me was the time I spent with the traction inspectors. This was an opportunity to get out and about, learn about the railway geography, how trains are driven, the interaction with signalling systems. It was just a window on a completely different world. And at the time, there was a technical tour to Bristol. So there's 47622, 11th of May, 1987, when it was named. A few days later, I went into work and I was told, we've got a little job for you today. And the inspector had got a twinkle in his eye. So I thought, well, what's on the end of this? And there's a package. It's quite a thin package, but it's quite wide, very long. When I picked it up, rather heavy. I was just told to take it to London. Don't worry, the address is on a label. Onto an HST, up to Paddington, into a taxi. The address was 1 Birdcage Walk. So I staggered in through the steps downstairs and put it on the reception desk. And I'm really pleased to say that it's still there downstairs today. I had a Royal excursion. This was interesting as well. I did my design training with what was known as the environment section, which was basically air conditioning, noise and acoustics. But I actually got the opportunity to design the air conditioning system for 2919, which is one of the Royal Train vehicles. So quite a privilege there, and also a privilege to maybe understand more than I should have known, shall we say, about the operation of the Royal Train. Training, of course, had to come to an end, and we were all paraded in front of the senior managers at the time to be told our fortunes. And the individuals coming out before I went in were all giving me the tip, look, they're after people in plant and machinery. And I thought, it's time to make my mind up. I've either got to speak my mind or put up with it, because my heart was in traction and rolling stock. So I went in, I was offered a job in plant and machinery, and I spoke up and said, look, you know, my heart really is in rolling stock. I don't particularly want a job in plant and machinery. And you get those pregnant pauses. This was the longest one that I've ever experienced. Fortunately, they said, okay, we'll send you to Wembley. So it did pay off to speak up. That was an interesting 6 months. The DVTs were being delivered at the time for push-pull services. It was interesting to discover that you could drive the train from a laptop on a trolley on the flat next to it. Fortunately, we found the brake command fairly quickly. But the interesting point for me was the day we first went out up to Crewe. We went out of the north end of Wembley, crossed the up, slow down, slow up, fast, onto the down fast. So the whole train is snaked across all 4 lines and sits down. we discovered that the RCH jumpers had been spec'd too short. So cable length really is important. Then a move to Wales. Thank you, James, for that introduction to Wales. I soon learned in my first proper job that this was absolutely key. Get involved in as much as you can and learn as much as you can. I need to go to Shrewsbury, boss. I was part of the fitment of radio electronic token block equipment onto the 37s for the Cambrian. So I think I can say it now. It was a really good excuse to get out and about and test it. And that's why I needed to go to Shrewsbury. All sorts of other things happened that I dived into. So it was everything from naming ceremonies to clearing out old wagons from freight yards to make some space. That was an interesting exercise. You can't probably see it in the photographs, but we're talking oil bearings, spoked wheels, spring buffers, and we had to get them all fit to move. I had an introduction to solid state traction control at the time, and that was achieved through trial running locos. We'd take them out on 4S81, the Coatbridge Freightliner, as far as Crewe. And one particular inspector who sadly passed away in the last fortnight really went out of his way to teach me all about that sort of traction control. But it wasn't just technical while you were out and about. The drivers of that service came from Hereford Depot, a small depot. And again, if you showed an interest, they would pay that back in spades and, you know, teach you all sorts of things about ops and signalling, particularly on the north and west route, which is really where I started to get a true appreciation of ops, which is something, as you'll see later, never really left me. Other things I got involved with, I never thought I'd see a Deltic in the servicing shed at Canton, but the Deltic Preservation Society were out and about in South Wales. I put my hand up to host them, and there's the evidence along with what I call little and large. That's one of the cut down shunters for the Gwendryth Valley, that's Kidwelly. What else did I get involved in? Re-railing. So I'd started to become part of the re-railing gang. I later went on to become a crane manager after suitable training. But this was all really good grounding in the sorts of things that I had to call on later in my career. Privately owned locos was another interesting one. This really got me into a lot of the industrial premises where there were exchange sidings and privately owned locos shunting. We had to do an annual examination, but of course you get talking to the terminal staff and come and have a look around and you understand more about the local industry. I'm not sure many people do this now, but at the end of one particular week, I stopped and mused and I tried to work out how I'd been into work 9 times in a week. Of course, the point here was that you could go in on a morning shift, go home on afternoons, come back on nights, and you'd be 8 in, 8 off, 8 in, 8 off. It was tiring at the time, and rightly, we've now got the regulations around working hours and particularly fatigue management, but that was quite a practical exercise. And on the safety front, I did have a very close brush in the yard at Canton. If I hadn't have been quicker in getting out of the way, I don't know what would have happened, but that was all down to a driver propelling around the shed. And that lesson, I think, for me, really stuck around operational safety and engineering depots. So a lesson that I've called on later in my career. Coal trains were still going at the time. They still are, just to this place. This is a little lonely place on the hill above Merthyr Tydfil called Cumbargoed. We were having a problem with shifted tyres. So it's 28 HAA hoppers, an MGR train, coming down from Cumbargoed, and I mean down. So the line speed's 10 miles an hour. Down means a ruling grade, and it's pretty constant of 1 in 42 for 4 miles. So I'll leave you calculate the drag braking time. Temporarily, I put a little bit more brake force on the front. So it was me that was responsible for the triple-headed 37s. But the serious point was that the solution was to get the line speed raised. Something I didn't think would happen, but I was told at the time I was probably the first rolling stock engineer on the Western to have a line speed raise. So that was interesting for me. Graphic design popped in then because it was the train load freight era. A design I think that could be possibly a little timeless. So you can see there construction locos. You'll have to forgive the photo bomber. Coal locos, metals locos, and sorry, I've used it again, petroleum locos, but quite a recognisable brand. I moved on then from Canton to what I think was probably the best job I've ever had, and that was as area engineer at Margam. Essentially, I'd got a traction depot. I also had an introduction to the world of wagons. Here's a quote from one of my former bosses. They're just boxes on wheels, but the really complex ones have bogies. So there's the wagon shop. And essentially, it was just myself and a train crew manager that once the commercial people had done the deal with the industrial premises, ran the railway in Southwest Wales, and that really was a wonderful job for me. It was a time that took me into processes, the fact that you needed to have them, you needed to make sure that people understood them, and you assured yourself that you were compliant to them. And this was the early days of BS 5750. And I was told at the time that we introduced the first quality standard for UK rail for traction, for wagons, and for train examination. So that was a proud moment for me. But whilst I was there, of course, it didn't all go smoothly. And what do you do when it goes wrong? So this is a train of iron ore. It's coming out of the terminal in Port Talbot, heading for Llanwern, west of, I've lost my Welsh geography, east of Newport. Thank you. Took a Scotsman to remind me of that. Simply, the Severn wasn't dredged deep enough for the ore ships to come in from Sweden, from Australia, from South Africa up to Newport. So we carted it the last 30 miles, and it wasn't quite a straight derailment because other than that first wagon, most of the rest of the front of the train ended up perpendicular to the track, and it was quite a state. So that was my first excursion with the train, the breakdown train. We had a planning session and decided how we'd set it all out, and it was only when we talked to British Steel, as it was at the time, they said, look, you just can't do that there. And we looked and we said, well, no, we want to set the crane out there. We're going to put the outriggers out and stabilise it. And they were all shaking their heads. Unbeknown to us, British Oxygen were the other side of the main line, and the 2000 PSI main for the blast furnaces was right underneath us. So we had a bit of a replan. That really got me fascinated in freight. So who was making what, how they did it, where we took it, and who did what with it at the other end, if you'll forgive the English, really fascinated me. And I got quite interested in a lot of the industrial processes and flows, which then linked me to wanting to understand more about industrial history in South Wales and how it links to the railway. And this is another point for me. I think it's important to understand where you've come from to get to today to help inform you as to where you might want to go in the future. The sobering part for me, of course, was having a big customer next door, and I mean a big customer, and actually being part of their production line. So it was fairly cut and thrust. You needed to shift the goods on time. So there's a torpedo car coming out of number 4 blast. It's 50, you heard that right, 50-ton axle load. But I've got to admit that's not a picture from my time. I took this on the annual technical tour a couple of years ago, and it's something that I'd heartily recommend to everyone to consider joining. There's information on the Railway Division's website shortly before applications launch. And I've got a link now with operations. Most of my train examiners were versatile, as we called them, so they operated the yards. And that, again, was a little part of the spark for me to retain an interest in ops. But that's all the hardware. I think the thing that made it for me was having committed people. So there's one of the loco shed teams. I think that was a work anniversary for Lindsay Sly in the middle there. That's admittedly a pose shot, but that's us putting Allied Steel and Wire's logos on our wagons in linkage with industry, and a proud day when Bob Reid, the BRB chairman, came to see us. And there was a whole load of variety of rail freight at the time. I'm not going to go through it all, but we got petroleum from Milford Haven, which usually work well, but not always. And the second picture there is a train for the Royal Naval Armaments Depot at Tricoon. Interesting little site because they had a 762mm gauge internal railway, 2'6" in old money. It traversed the entire site into 58 storage caverns in either side of the hillside, and the entire infrastructure was copper, simply to avoid sparks in places you really don't want sparks. They've got their own locomotive shed and locos. They've got their own specially built wooden wagons that were enclosed with sliding roof covers, so the sea mines could be lifted in from the top. And quite a privilege and a fascinating place to have a look around. More coal from the Gwendryth Valley. That's an interesting shot. That's a little place called Onfloyn. But behind the loco, and more so to the left, is now the site of GCRE, which is obviously something that's up and coming, and I'm there in a couple of weeks' time. Chemicals in Swansea. 6E33 was interesting from a train examination perspective. So this is the empty acetic acid tanks that came in from Saltend in Hull, used in the industrial conversion of ethylene and chlorine to vinyl chloride, that of course is polymerized into PVC. Suffice to say that when we went to examine that train, the yard smelled like a chip shop. And there's a few more shots and a few more places here. This is the sort of conditions that unfortunately we were working in, but a really dedicated team. That's Cumgra. That's lime coming in from Harrison Sidings, Shatbeck Quarry, into the steel works in CBAs, which were covered MGR hoppers. And at the time, we were actually conveying reclaimed coal that years ago in the 10s and 20s was tipped because it was low grade, but actually worth recovering. We had some other goings on. passenger trains in the iron ore terminal, for instance. The Wagon Shops in Margam was shunted by a tractor. Yeah, loose shunting with a tractor in those days. What on earth do you do when your tractor breaks down? They're not the sort of thing that are readily available. But a mate of mine in Wigan, I knew he'd got a spare one. So how to get a tractor from Wigan to Port Talbot? Well, it's easy. You send up your well troll and it pops back 3 days later. And that's the sort of thing that you can't do today. And that was a really interesting 3 years for me, and I still maintain probably the best job I had. But it was time to move on, and I was given another opportunity by the same boss to move up to the West Midlands. And I learned there that sometimes you have an agenda and you have to pursue it. On the first day, he walked me down the drive, and just before we got to the gate, he whispered these words to me. What you need to remember, Andrew, is they're paid 12 hours, rostered for 8, and only work 4. Hence the title of the slide, You Need to Sort It Out. That I thought was going to be quite an uphill task, particularly when the working conditions weren't very good at all. But you've got to take the people with you. We did an awful lot of tidying up. The inside of the depot was refurbished as well, new mess rooms, signage, and we painted in Transrail colours. So even the window frame in my office went red. Early on in that job, I discovered the weekend only pool. So we had a fleet of locomotives that were dedicated to infrastructure work. They were brought out of the holding sidings on a Friday. Most were flat or low coolant. They went onto the shed, they were charged, the coolant leaks were fixed in time for Sunday night so they could go back down to the holding sidings. And aside from that, when they started, most of Walsall was obliterated. So after 3 weeks, we got rid of that pool and did all the work with the remaining locos. My job then expanded. I picked up Chester Wagon Shops. Again, we did a lot of tidying up there. Very proud team. But what I felt Bescot needed was an identity. We needed a bit of a flagpole. So instead of having a flagpole, I went for a headboard. You probably can't read it, but it simply says Transrail Bescot. We painted up some locos. This was a unique livery. You can see the team there. And it went out and about. Sutton Park on coal trains, bottom left, Llandudno Junction, bottom right, passenger train in Lawley Street Freightliner terminal. But our name and identity was getting around. And it was all part of trying to bring the morale up and give the depot that identity. We had a particularly bad winter. It's a story that's too long to go into, but basically I decided I'd never had experience of snow ploughs. They were heading out. I was with them. And we'd gone through D Marsh. So we're on the Wirral now, heading up towards Bidston. And I said to the traction inspector just before we got there, I said, shouldn't we stop before we get to Bidston? He said, what do you mean, lad? I said, well, we need to stop. Why on earth do we need to stop? He said, I want to get home. I said, well, what about the flaps and the third rail? He said, we'll stop. So sometimes you just need to pipe up and, you know, if you feel you're right or you've got something to say it. And while I was at Bescot, there was a family connection. So Dorothy Windlow Pattison, better known as Sister Dora. A class 31 was named, but was withdrawn. The name was hanging around in the stores. And my maternal grandmother, her middle name was Dora, taken directly from Sister Dora. So we ended up with another unique livery, and there's the headboard again. I had a call from control one morning. You're going to get a visitor. It's the police. What have the lads done now was my first thought. No, we've got a bit of an incident. You need to get there quickly. So no sooner had the phone gone down, the police are at the door. We need you to come with us. Don't worry about the red lights. If we go through, you just follow us. hotbox on a nuclear flask train. They wanted to get it cleared PDQ, so there was some fairly quick thinking. Is it safe to move it? We managed to get it moved, and that's probably the only time I've seen a loaded flask train in a maintenance depot. This brings us up to privatisation, and I actually went back to Cardiff. I was successful in getting the depot engineer's role. It was a bit of a new outlook with privatisation. We got new owners. Wisconsin Central had bought the freight railway, but my key question was, can two cultures merge? I'll just leave it as a question, I think. So this for me was quite a project. It brought a lot of skills together because we were charged with setting up new teams to do different work that Canton had been used to in the past. There's some of them now on the Jack Road. And it was actually a real change of direction for many people because part of the work was overhauling wagons. The other part was actually overhauling coaches. And this is something I never thought I'd see the guys and girls in Canton doing, but we did it really proudly and a very good job for Royal Mail and got some really good ties with them. So as I put it, that was from cylinder heads to laying lino. I had a sideways move to become an area engineer with EWS, still involved in mail, but more involved in the TPOs. They were still running at the time, and a privilege to see the underground railway. But I realised I'd only got technical experience, no commercial experience, and the railway had been privatised. So in a bit of a shock move to some of my chums, I got an infrastructure services manager's role, selling ballast trains to rail tracks simply. I worked with Railtrack in their offices. It was a job where I had to understand my resources, train crew, locos, wagons, a lot of detail and planning, especially because the trains I was planning were running when there were many possessions anyway. So that for me was a real good lesson in rail geography in the Midlands, and also a point where I bumped into the PWI's track handbook. I never thought there was as much geometry involved in track layouts as there is. Excellent book. Can't profess to understand it all, but it's certainly worth a thumb through. And then for my big change from the freight railway to the passenger railway, I saw a job ad in Modern Railways for a fleet improvements project manager to manage a big package of upgrades to the high-speed train fleet. I was successful. So I moved across to Great Western and the passenger railway. Roscoe's, that was something that was new to me. That was a real baptism of fire. Very, very interesting. But it was a job that brought people skills, technical skills and commercial skills together in one for me. I'm not going to read through them all, but that list probably just gives you a flavour. Once that project was coming to fruition, I was promoted into a new role, fleet engineering manager. This involved a new organisation, setting up a new team, and we expanded beyond the high-speed train railway that we'd got. I'm forgetting the sleeper, sorry, Night Riviera. We picked up Thames trains in 2004, so the network of turbos in Reading. Wessex trains in April 2006, so a lot of DMUs in the Bristol and the West Country. But this was a role where I could now feel that I could start coaching and giving to others. I became a registered professional mentor, and there was the opportunity for a bit of strategy and planning. I saw a niche for perpetuating electronic systems overhaul, something that we set Great Western up to do, and we've successfully over the years continued not only to do that for ourselves, but also make sales externally. I swung back then to depot management as a fleet manager, proudly leading 4 more depots on the Western region. The picture isn't at one of them, that's round the turntable in Didcot, which really brings us to today. As James said, I'm head of engineering, so essentially I set policy. I'm responsible for fleet technical standards and assurance, occupational health and safety across all the depots, our integrated management system accredited to 4 standards, material procurement and processes, data analysis and reporting, and one I never ever thought I'd be in charge of, engineering IT systems. So it's a bit of a smorgasbord, but it does keep me off the street corners and I do rather enjoy it. Audience participation, it's quiz time. The HST. So maybe I ought to exclude you, Clive, sorry. What do these have in common? The Imperial typewriter, the Wilkinson sword razor, Morphy Richards iron, Kodak Instamatic camera, and the Kenwood chef. Any offers? Sorry? Well done, absolutely. Same industrial designer. There he is, Sir Kenneth Grange, in front of his power car. Huge privilege to know Sir Kenneth, an absolute gentleman, and just astounding when he told me the story that he went in to see the board around interior styling for the HST, and he'd been kept waiting. So he doodled around his interior designs and had his own thoughts on the front end. And of course, that front end is the front end that we have and know today. And then finally, my roles expanded into a lot of other fleets, IETs, electric multiple units, and also battery electric multiple units now. I'm finding many challenges can be resolved based on experience and judgment. And some of the key things that I've done are signing IETs into service after safety validation. I produce now our statements of compatibility, which is where that operations experience is really, really helpful. You're all probably aware of the cracking issue on the IETs. That risk assessment to put them back into service occupied me for a weekend. And all sorts of things with the team, coaching them, developing them, and also some cross-mentoring. And working more now with industry groups such as that, responding to Carmont. And I've alluded probably all the way through to my interest in operations. Some know, some don't, but I've actually been a fully qualified guard for the last 15 years. So my summary really is, in educational terms, make sure it's broad. Try things that you don't fancy, you might actually like some. Have a mixed experience, get all that you can. Some of it's useful at some point in time. Understand your history. Remember, every day is a school day. Safety is obviously important. Have the confidence to speak up, and also understanding the importance of having processes. My thanks to Professor Felix Schmid. I've borrowed this diagram from him with his knowledge, but I also think it's important not only to understand the rolling stock, but that whole system around you. Probably most importantly, of course, are the people. I spoke earlier about the extra bed and friends for life. So I'll leave you conclude whether they're parcels or left luggage. So there's 6 of the 10 of us that are still in touch today. I think Robin's got a picture of himself there, so there you go. There's some of my friends from Canton, we're still in touch. But it's about understanding people, giving them what they need to do a good job, understanding it's not always easy. Sometimes you've got to form new teams, that's not easy too. But keep people with you through uncertainty, build the team, give to the team. And of course, we mustn't forget young people because they help and shape the future. And I think all those threads really then come together in the railway division. And I've actually put the Railway Engineers Forum logo at the centre of that slide. That is a forum that comprises of all those institutions, and I was proud to chair for the last couple of years. So, with that bio and thoughts out of the way, where are we now? These are my personal thoughts. The railway's actually at a crossroads at the moment. Finance, we had to talk about it. In the passenger world, fare box receipts are reduced, so there are cost pressures. An observation is that we've got more interfaces in the industry than ever before, and they nearly all are commercial. So they're bound to have a fiscal markup, and from a safety perspective, a significant number contain safety risk. But just thinking back, during sectorisation, BR actually made some advances, the subsectors, organisation for quality, having local management teams. Post-privatisation, the successes such as the West Coast Partnership, and Evergreen on Chiltern. And just looking at passenger numbers, we know we can do it. Look at that rise from 1980 up to shortly before COVID, a dramatic rise in passenger numbers. I mean, we're now seeing leisure travel at around 125% of pre-pandemic levels, but the yield is significantly down. Carbon, climate and environment. So there's Decarbonising Transport, a better, greener Britain. This is Department for Transport in July 21. Plans by 2040 to remove all diesel trains, and by 2050 for the rail network to be net carbon zero. So there's a slide with the detail and the policy statement that came from it. Forgive me with the next slide, but I think these words are quite eloquent, and this is from Why We Mean Green from RDG. Travelling by train is more than a journey. It's the greenest form of public transport and the ready-made solution for a low-carbon future. Roads are quieter and safer, and the air we breathe is cleaner. Emerging from the pandemic, there's a chance to pursue a cleaner, greener recovery. And with government's commitment to reduce carbon emissions, we all need to play our part. So the industry is working hard to become even greener. Simply taking the train helps tackle climate change, cutting carbon emissions compared to travelling by car, and we can do more in the future. That's why we want more people and freight to switch to rail. Separately, my good friend David Shearers has done some analysis suggesting that emissions per passenger, if rail transport is a base of 1, there's 12 times the emissions if you travel by road, 53 times by air. And in terms of rail vehicles in the UK, diesel versus electric rail vehicles, there's unsurprisingly 4.5 times the emissions from a diesel vehicle. And the argument for freight is similar. Of all rail freight in the UK, of the energy used to move that rail freight, only 3.7% is electric. So we know where the rest is. So my view is we need to tackle finance, but not simply costs. Keep our eye on people because we need to bring them back to the railway whilst maintaining safety. And carbon is really important to us as well. So just to cover those in a small amount of detail, in terms of finance, we need to bring revenue and costs together. At the moment, they're separated. The freight subsectors I talked about earlier were very successful in having costs and revenue together. And that will avoid some perverse incentives with organisations sometimes at the moment acting in isolation. And there's some early evidence. GWR's alliance with Network Rail and the East Coast Partnership. But I don't believe we can remain in a world of cost cutting with no investment. So I think investment needs to be tactically targeted for the benefit of passengers and freight. So just turning to Rail Partners' Track to Growth, published in July this year. To ensure cost is not reduced to the detriment of revenue, it's essential to consider both sides of the ledger and the net impact of decisions. So there's some support there. Considering cost and revenue holistically would help allow operators to begin closing the financial gap left by the pandemic and bring passengers back to rail in greater numbers. People. I wanted to touch on this. I know it's not engineering, but I feel very strongly that fares and ticketing need to be simplified. We all know that moving staff out of ticket offices is currently on the agenda, but I don't think we should lose sight of the complexity that ticket types present, particularly to unfamiliar passengers. So I think it will be interesting to see the results of the GNER trial. Here's a question: is GBR the right thing? Well, here's one view. The train operators become one step removed with Network Rail in the middle. But to my mind, the service operator is best placed to understand their customers. So my initial answer is no. But of course, there's a but this is a however. I strongly believe we still need a guiding mind and fewer of those interfaces to improve safety performance. So maybe I'm saying yes at the same time. So a little more from track to growth. A thriving railway is a crucial tool for driving prosperity across Britain. A lower carbon form of transport, a successful railway can act as an engine for green growth, helping meet net zero and air quality targets. Nearly 5 years on from Williams and after the pandemic, delayed reform is undermining rail's ability to deliver to its full potential. We've got some critical choices, particularly around bringing passengers back and making rail attractive against other modes. So, investment in capacity will provide the ability for rail to accept modal shift of both freight and passengers. I think we'd all agree the world needs to decarbonise, and UK rail is actually really well placed to act as a catalyst for economic growth and decarbonisation for both freight and passengers. And I like these two particularly from Jim Steer. Rail is largely absent in government thinking on the greatest challenge we collectively face. But this is the hinge likely to turn around the case for rail investment. Over long distances, rail is the only possible choice to get transport on track for carbon reduction. There are already some signs of change, and I feel that we should all press rail's credentials at absolutely every opportunity. So I think in conclusion, we are at a new dawn. Rail is a solution and our bright future awaits. A short slide on my priorities. Threefold, quite simply. I've already said it. Young people shape the industry and they're our future. Another unashamed plug here for the IMechE Railway Division Railway Challenge. Excellent opportunity for apprentices, undergrads, grads, universities to get together, build a loco and trial it against set criteria. Again, there's details on the IMechE Railway Division website as to how to get involved. Clearly the decarb agenda, so the green credentials of rail are absolutely our USP, and I believe will be a significant contribution to drive UK and global net zero. And finally, the third one, the institution. It requires governance, stability and finances that are able to support its and our future. So those are the three areas that are key to me that I wish to concentrate on. I do have some acknowledgements. Firstly, to my parents. You saw my mum in the early slide. So to them, for all their encouragement. To my family, I was going to say for putting up with me, for being part of my life with rail. To my two girls, Rose and Phoebe, and to my wife, Jess, who's with us tonight, her first time in the building for 28 years. A former staff member, so I'll leave you draw your conclusions to how we came to meet. I'm also indebted to Barry Evans. He was the individual that gave me those early career breaks in South Wales, and he's done a lot to help me on my way. To my teams, it's not really me, it's my teams that have delivered. They're the people, they're the important ones. And also to my many friends from the railway family. So thank you to everyone in the room for joining me tonight, and to those online. If you want to get hold of me, you can grab me afterwards if you're here. If you're not, or you want to make a note, there are my details. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to address everybody this evening. So all I can say beyond that is thank you very much.
Andrew, a fascinating insight into the various systems that are prevalent in the railway industry now, which you seem to have dabbled in throughout your career. The question I'd like to your thoughts on are, you mentioned the Railway Engineers Forum, which covers all of the various systems within the railway industry. How do you think the Railway Engineers Forum should move forward, and should the IMechE be taking any particular role in supporting it moving forward to promote the industry?
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, that's one that will need a little bit of thought. It's never an easy one, because it's a forum with civil engineers, mechanical engineers, electricals, and I think we've got to be careful with that E in the middle, the Railway Engineers Forum, because some of you might have noticed when the slide was up, the CIRO, the Chartered Institution of Railway Operators, are part. So I was having thoughts during my chair's year as to whether Railway Engineers Forum is actually the right title, because operators are and are rightly part of that forum. I think that the time has probably come for us all across the institutions really to get behind the point I made about rail's USP and to push the green credentials. So I think that's probably the area that it should move into. None at all. More from the room. David?
Thank you very much, Andrew. Having been a mere youngster starting a year later than you, I recognise a lot of that. Although I'm an interloper here as a civil engineer, but I did work for Trainload Freight, so I recognise the effectiveness of that organisation as you described it. And also I recognise many of the changes that you talk about, through your career. I've seen many of those too. My question is, you talk about railway being well positioned for green growth. The elephant in the room is that as an industry, we're perceived to be too expensive, and there's a very big price tag. Whilst we might have the solution to decarbonisation, there's a big price tag. The government is bust, etc. So, what are your thoughts about? I totally agree with your diagnosis, but what are your thoughts about how, as an industry, and how the professional engineering institutions can help make the case to show that we can deliver these things efficiently, and we should be trusted with that investment?
I think, David, it comes back to my point about interfaces. There are more and more interfaces that have all got a fiscal markup, and I think that's one of the key things that's holding us back. If you look at civils projects, particularly, there seems to be, to my mind, less rigor around program management, and scope creep seems almost accepted rather than having a plan and sticking to it. So I think, to my mind, it's a combination of the two. But of course, it leaves professional engineers in a difficult position, because you're simply too expensive is the strap line that a number will roll out. So I think it's incumbent on us, particularly where we don't believe projects are on the rails, to highlight those and question why they're creeping as they are. Anything online, James? There wasn't there? Sorry. And there was me hoping we could avoid HS2. Yeah. No, that's absolutely fine, and a very fair question. It is obviously difficult at the moment. I mean, we're coming out of the pandemic. The money that was sunk into keeping the country afloat. There are other issues for the government currently, obviously, in Eastern Europe. However, I would still maintain that there needs to become a point where we start to tactically invest in capacity, because, and maybe I didn't make the point too well earlier, but that investment in capacity provides the ability to achieve modal shift, and it's that modal shift that can assist us with net zero. And I think Jim Steer's quote around the hinge and government is a telling one. So I think it's that rhetoric that really needs to reach those further down the road, James, in Westminster.
Yeah, okay.
Andrew, linked to that one, I suppose you spent a lot of your career, from the looks of it, in regional railways as opposed to big major cities. And I just wondered whether there was anywhere that you'd like to see more investment in regional railways within the UK, and where you think that can make a real impact in terms of driving the green credentials and modal shift and prosperity within regional areas of the UK?
Yeah, sure. I think probably a project close to home springs to mind, and that's the trial that Great Western have got going on at the moment with fast charging of a battery train. And that's the essence of the trial. It's the fast charging, not the running of the battery train. I'm convinced that that's going to be successful, and clearly, that's then got opportunities to, replicate itself aside from the trial site between West Ealing and Greenford, onto other of the Thames Valley branches, into Devon and Cornwall, and that meets the decarb agenda as well. So I think that's probably one relatively simple and, again, relatively low cost way of improving decarb and local services. Got Richard here, Fiona.
Hi, Andrew. You're in the interesting position of dealing with the, I suppose it's the British, but essentially the English government in west of the border, but you also got a lot to do with the Welsh Assembly and the way the Welsh are managing their railways. Maybe you could compare and contrast what lessons can be learned and the best practice from either of the two approaches.
I'm certainly seeing the railway coming back together in Wales through vertical integration. I'm not saying that with a weather eye on renationalisation at all. Pretty well mirrored in Scotland, and I think it's people working together with the same goals and for the same cause. It just adds that greater impetus and the ability to get things done rather than many actors, many discussions, many disagreements, 10 reasons why it can't be done as opposed to just getting on with it. That's probably the quick compare and contrast.
You have a couple of questions online. Okay, I've managed to turn my microphone on as well now. So the next one moves into a different direction, so it becomes a bit more about you. So this is from Simon Jarrett, who says, well, firstly, thanks very much for the great presentation. What are you most proud of in your career? Your proudest moment?
Ooh, thanks for that one, Simon. God, that's difficult. Probably I would say two things. One is thinking back to South Wales and the hugely enjoyable time I had with the massive team on the freight railway. That was just an absolute joy to maintain rolling stock and deliver services for customers, be in with some of the customers' meetings and be part of their production line, and it becoming a really sort of tight-knit family. The other one for me, probably more recently, was the relatively onerous task of going through the safety validation to get the intercity express trains into service for Great Western. That was more technically based, a lot of hard work, but well worth the effort for those new trains that we've got in service.
It's some substantial milestones. Very good, thank you. And there was a second question from Tim Stubbs. What steps could be taken to increase the quantity of graduate engineers joining the railway industry?
Money probably springs to mind immediately. No, seriously, it's generally that is starting to hold organisations back. So without having an immediate answer, are there innovative ways of getting graduate engineers into the industry, maybe not at a traditional cost? I don't have any immediate answers, but maybe there is something out there. One thing, though, that is for certain, I remember Barry, who I acknowledged towards the end of the presentation, he said to me a number of years before I left South Wales, he said, look, Andrew, he said, you're going to be one of the last for a while. And of course, that was with privatisation looming. And sure enough, the number of grads taken on went right down, plateaued at zero for a number of years before it took off again. And it was almost as though there was a missing generation. And the one thing that's certain is we cannot do that again. We need to keep young talent coming through the industry.
I think certainly Tim would be a strong advocate for that as well. Okay, back in the room. That concludes the questions at the moment from online.
Thanks very much, Andrew. It's a fantastic presentation today. It was really great. Could I just ask a supplement really to what Tim Stubbs has said? You started off with a thin sandwich course with British Rail. More recently, it's tended to be recruitment at graduate level. Have you any thoughts on the benefit the thin sandwich brought to you and whether or not actually trying to recruit people earlier before they actually even decide what they're going to do at university is a better way, or is there something else we can do to encourage young people to understand that there's a great opportunity for engineering in rail?
I think there's some of that going on. Certainly a number of the centres press that message. But to answer your question more directly, Clive, I guess I just go back to that experience that I had. You were employed. I was at university with, at the time, a local education authority grant rather than the student loan, but I was also being paid by the railway. So I got a little bit of additional income, but it was the experience for me that did it. You know, never mind that small amount extra that came every week. And I think for people that have an interest, if we could maybe get back to that, you know, I've said to a number of young people since, and whilst my daughters aren't in engineering, it's the same message for them to end up going into employment, not just with a degree, but a degree mixed with experience is, I think, invaluable because you've got the edge of experience over and above that degree certificate. So it certainly worked for me. I think it's a really good route to go down. Maybe it is something that we ought to look at reopening.
And we do have time for one more question. There aren't any more in the meeting chat. Last one over there.
I'll build on what Clive said and what you've said. These days, there's a thing called a degree apprenticeship. And as far as I can tell, that triggers you to be able to use the apprenticeship levy to use on people who would otherwise be going to university, incurring all this student debt. Like you, I did a sandwich course and I had my university fees paid and I paid salary all the way through and came out of it debt free. That's a big saving for youngsters. And if we could offer them something at a reasonable salary at age 18, they could work, they could get their degree qualifications. It might take a year or two longer to get to master's level, but that will be really powerful if that could be achieved. And John Reddyhoff knows a bloody sight more about it than I do, but that seems to me to be something we could advocate for engineering training.
Yeah, and I think if you've got a good scheme with a good package that can engender loyalty, then you've got those young people for a few more years to come as well, Malcolm. Thank you.
Very good. Right, thank you very much, Andrew, for taking some time for the questions and answers. I will be asking somebody to come and give a vote of thanks in a moment, but before I do that, I just want to take the opportunity while I have the microphone to talk about some future events that the institution are hosting in the next couple of months, so they're quite in the near future. So firstly, there is on the 25th of October at this building, Birdcage Walk, the Tribo Sensing and Condition Monitoring event. It's the journey to net zero. So whilst it might not immediately sound obvious how it links to us, I think there's a lot of sustainability stuff there already. There is then the rolling stock whole life cost optimization event, which it's an all-day conference on the 9th of November. That's here at Birdcage Walk again. Then we have at the back end of November, so 30th of November to the 1st of December, the Young Engineers and Apprentices Railway Seminar. So huge kind of opportunity for people to understand more about the industry as young engineers and apprentices. And that title is Integrated Travel and will be held at Sheffield Hallam University.
Absolutely superb for young engineers and apprentices. And, you know, I'd advocate for anybody that's got, you know, young people in those categories to seriously consider sending them. It is a very low cost opportunity.
Very good. And one final event, which is comes back to your plant and machinery element. It's reducing conservatism in structural integrity, plant life management and extension evaluations. That's actually going to be held in Manchester on the 21st of November. All of these will be on the IMechE website near you, and you can go online to find out more about them there. So now I'd like to hand over to Andy Zhang from RSSB to give a vote of thanks. Well, do you remember? Let's see, near that micro. Oh, just make sure that microphone works.
Oh, that was.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Andrew, for your fantastic presentation. I think one point that really resonated with me that you might be quite pleased to hear that hasn't changed in our industry over all these years is how friendly the railway industry is. And I think that will really inspire me to, you know, utilize that to the maximum and extract as much knowledge and experience from people like yourself and other colleagues to promote my own growth. I think the other bit was about looking, you know, a bit at the future and really saying that the rail industry needs to really, you know, ask what is its meaning in the post-COVID world and really redefine itself and defeat all the naysayers, really. And there's a path forwards, and I think that is something that we all need to think about. But yeah, so could I invite everyone to give Andrew a round of applause for the excellent presentation?
And that concludes this lecture. So thank you very much online people for popping in and certainly answering, listening, obviously, and your questions. And there's some hand clapping going on there. And for those of you in the room, a reminder that there is also a drinks reception in the council room upstairs. So thank you again and good night. Safe trip home.